At the most painful moment of the wake, a street child appeared out of nowhere, walked to the little girl's coffin and said, "Your daughter's killer is standing right behind you." The man froze, and what happened next became a true tragedy. The pain in that room seemed endless. The body of little Alice, just 8 years old, lay motionless in a white coffin with gold details, adorned with a pale rose and a delicate floral crown on her blonde hair. Just a day before, she had been alive, playing in the mansion's library. The next morning, she was found lifeless, lying in front of the gates of her father, Gerald's property. Gerald was a millionaire businessman known for his discretion. No one could explain what had happened. There were no signs of a struggle or witnesses, just silence and an impossible void to fill. The chapel was filled with devastated faces, black clothes, red eyes, muffled sighs, family, friends, and employees of the mansion, all trying to understand the incomprehensible. Gerald held his hands together, his gaze lost on his daughter. Beside him, his brother Michael, with gray hair and a heavy expression, watched him in silence, while his son, Hector, with his arms crossed, looked at the floor. It was impossible not to wonder how a child so full of life could disappear like that, from one day to the next, as if her soul had vanished with the wind. She was fine. Just yesterday she asked me for pancakes for breakfast, Gerald murmured to himself, almost whispering, as if clinging to an insignificant detail to keep from going crazy. Michael discreetly touched his shoulder. "Be strong, brother. That's all. Just be strong." But there was no strength to fill that void. Alice was the light of the house, smart, affectionate, full of questions. Her room still smelled of children's perfume, and now there she was, pale, motionless, with her eyelashes like she was just sleeping. It was in this setting that the unexpected happened. The chapel door creaked, and all eyes turned to it. A child walked in. No one knew who he was. Dark skin, ripped denim overalls, short hair, and a determined face. The contrast between his appearance and the solemn atmosphere caused immediate discomfort. "Who let him in?" a woman in the last row whispered, but he walked without hesitation, step by step, as if he had been born for this moment. The looks alternated between indignation, curiosity, and astonishment. The boy approached the coffin. Absolute silence. He looked at Alice, took a deep breath, and extended his small hand. His fingers touched hers with an almost reverent care. "You promised me you would teach me how to draw big houses," he murmured, in a choked voice. A murmur swept through the room. Gerald stood up, confused. "Who is this boy?" he whispered to a nearby aunt. No one knew. Then the boy looked up and said to Gerald, loud and clear, so everyone could hear, "Your daughter's killer is standing right behind you." The phrase exploded like dynamite inside the chapel. Someone gasped. A woman let out a stifled scream. An elderly man put his hands to his mouth. Gerald, not understanding, stood there stunned. "What are you talking about?" he asked in a trembling, almost breathless voice. The boy then turned slowly, raised his arm, and pointed firmly. His finger stopped on Michael. The room seemed to spin. All eyes turned to the gray-haired man. Michael remained still, pale, showing no reaction. "Repeat what you said," Gerald demanded, now standing, his voice trembling. But the boy did not repeat. He only lowered his arm, took a deep breath, and looked Gerald in the eye. He said nothing more, and in that silence, something changed. The wake, which was about mourning and longing, turned into suspicion, confusion, and unease. The boy's look had weight, as if to say, "I saw, and I came to tell." The atmosphere inside the room was divided in two, and what seemed like the end was perhaps only the beginning. The room still hadn't recovered from the impact. The phrase spoken by the boy echoed like thunder that refused to fade. "The killer of your daughter is standing right behind you." And the silence that followed was even more deafening. Gerald remained standing, breathing with difficulty, trying to process what he had just heard. His eyes went from the boy to Michael, and back to his daughter in the coffin. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it wanted to jump out of his chest. "Can someone explain to me what is happening?" His voice came out hoarse, almost pleading. The boy remained motionless. His dirty hands were now pressed against each other, as if he were fighting to maintain the firmness that still sustained him. He looked at Gerald with eyes full of tears, but without backing away. There was something in that look that was not common for a child. A weight, a pain much greater than his age should carry. He took a step forward, hesitated, and then murmured, "My name is John. I was Alice's friend." The revelation generated another murmur. Friends? But how? No one had seen him before. She didn't tell anyone. We would meet hidden in the park. John swallowed hard. She said she couldn't talk about me, that her daddy didn't like her hanging out with people like me. The phrase was said with a mixture of resignation and pain. The comment hit Gerald like a dagger to the chest, and he was visibly shaken. Michael looked at his brother but remained silent. John continued, "But we were real friends. Every Saturday she would leave a little note under the bench, and I would go. We would play guessing games. We would draw on the ground with sticks." The memories seemed to weigh more when said aloud. Gerald sat down, heartbroken, with his hands clasped over his forehead. John looked at him as if asking for permission to continue. "The day before yesterday, the day she disappeared, we saw each other as always, but she was acting strange. She said she was scared, that someone had threatened her. The entire room was attentive to every syllable the boy spoke. I asked who it was, but she said she couldn't say. She just said she was going home early." He paused for a long time. His eyes began to tremble, as if the most difficult part was still to come. "I stayed watching from afar. That's when I saw her get into a black car, a big car with dark windows." Gerald's breathing stopped. John then pulled a folded piece of cardboard out of his overall pocket. It was crumpled, dirty, but it had something written on it with a blue pen, a sequence of numbers and letters. I was scared, but I wrote down the license plate. I thought that if something bad happened, at least I would have this. There was immediate movement. One of the police officers present, discreetly dressed in a suit in the back of the room, approached and took the paper from John's hands. He verified the information over the radio in his ear. A few seconds later, he froze. The color of his face changed. He looked at Gerald, then at Michael, and approached. "This license plate belongs to a vehicle registered in the name of Michael Guzman." The air went out of the room. Time stopped for a few seconds. Gerald turned to look at his brother in complete disbelief. "Michael, tell me this is a mistake." Gerald's voice was more of a whisper, pleading for it not to be true. Michael didn't respond. Suddenly another officer approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Guzman, you are under arrest, on suspicion of involvement in the death of Alice Guzman." Chaos erupted. People stood up. Some were crying. Others were screaming. Gerald watched the scene as if seeing a nightmare unfold before his very eyes. His brother being handcuffed, his daughter's wake being interrupted, and in the middle of it all, that boy, an invisible child who had just become the center of everything. The wake had ended in hours, but the image of the boy standing before the coffin still haunted Gerald like a ghost. The house was plunged into a silence that seemed to scream. Michael had been taken into police custody, and a reeling Gerald locked himself in Alice's room for over an hour, lying on his daughter's bed, with her diary pressed against his chest, though he didn't have the courage to open it. Outside, John remained seated in the same spot on the mansion steps, hugging his knees, looking at the sky. Seeing him there, so small, so alone, Gerald felt a pang in his chest. That boy had faced a crowded room, confronted an unknown family, and told the truth out loud, without even knowing if he would be heard. He took a deep breath, walked down the stairs in silence, and approached him. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked, trying to control his emotion. John just shook his head, saying nothing. "Do you want to stay here for a few days, until we understand everything?" The answer came in the form of a relieved look, followed by a timid nod. Gerald then led him inside. In the following days, John began to adapt to his new environment. Despite the mansion's grandeur, he preferred to stay in the simpler corners of the house, in the backyard, on the porch, sometimes near the abandoned chicken coop. He helped with small tasks, made his bed, watered the garden plants, and always left a small plate of food under the tree, where he used to talk with Alice in the park. Gerald watched this with a mixture of tenderness and guilt. In some way, that boy seemed to keep his daughter's presence alive in the house. However, not everyone seemed comfortable with his presence. Hector, Michael's son and Alice's cousin, remained in the mansion even after his father's arrest, under the care of a great-aunt who lived in the back of the property. During the day, they barely saw each other. But at night, something strange began to happen. One night, John woke up with the feeling that he was being watched. When he opened his eyes, he saw Hector standing in the bedroom doorway. He said nothing, just looked at him in silence, like a shadow that refused to disappear. The next night was worse. John heard noises coming from Alice's old room. He got up carefully, walked barefoot down the hallway, and stopped in front of the half-open door. Inside, he found Hector sitting on the floor with one of Alice's favorite toys in his hands, a hand-painted wooden horse. The boy was talking to himself in a low, hurried whisper. John stayed quiet, not breathing. A shiver ran down his back. He slowly backed away, returning to his room in silence, his heart racing. The next day he pretended that nothing had happened, but he started to avoid Hector. The looks the boy gave him now were filled with something he couldn't explain, a kind of silent threat, a resentment disguised as normalcy. Once, as he sat down for breakfast, John noticed that one of Alice's drawings had disappeared from the small table where he had left it the day before. He looked around, but no one seemed to have seen anything, only Hector, who was watching him from across the room with a half-smile on his lips. That night, John couldn't sleep. Leaning out the window, he watched the dark garden and tried to understand if what he had seen and heard was real. He wanted to tell Gerald. He wanted to trust him. But what if he thought it was an invention? What if it was just a product of fear? After all, it was already difficult enough to be a homeless boy. And now he was in a house where death had left deep marks, where Alice's absence seemed to weigh on every wall. But something inside him said that there were still secrets to uncover. With every sleepless night, John became more certain that something in that house didn't make sense. Ever since he saw Hector whispering alone in Alice's old room, something had ignited inside him. A fear that wouldn't go away and a suspicion that wouldn't stop growing. Hector avoided the boy during the day but gave him looks that seemed like silent threats. Gerald, on the other hand, no longer seemed so distant. Ever since John revealed what he saw, the man had begun to listen more, to observe more. He was still grieving, yes, but now there was something more in his eyes, a restlessness that kept him alert. It was on a gray afternoon when John decided to do what his heart told him. Hector had left the mansion with his aunt to buy medicine, and the house was silent. The cousin's room was upstairs, at the end of the hallway. With light steps, John went up the stairs, fighting the fear that settled in his chest. He stopped in front of the door, took a deep breath, and entered. The room was clean, almost impersonal. A car poster on the wall, a desk with scattered books and papers, and an antique dark wood dresser with 2 drawers slightly ajar. With his heart beating 1,000 times a minute, John opened the first drawer and searched among folded clothes and forgotten objects. Nothing. He opened the second. At the bottom, wrapped in a blue sock, was the necklace. Alice's necklace, the one with the golden butterfly pendant she wore every day. John held it in his hands as if he were touching fire. A knot formed in his throat. He was sure. This was proof. This was part of the truth everyone was looking for. He ran to where Gerald was, who was in the backyard checking the garage gate. "Mr. Gerald, I went into Hector's room. I know I shouldn't have, but I found this." Gerald looked at the necklace, and his expression changed. He immediately touched the pendant with trembling fingers, his eyes filled with tears. This was her favorite. "The last time I saw her with it was—" He didn't finish the sentence, just looked at John seriously and nodded slowly. He put the necklace in his shirt pocket. That night, the silence was heavier than ever. The house seemed to hold its breath. John remained quiet in his room, while Gerald walked the corridors thoughtfully, like someone sowing memories with suspicions. The next day, as soon as he returned, Hector seemed uneasy. His room was turned upside down. It took him a few minutes to notice that something had changed. He went to Gerald, trying to maintain a calm tone, but his nervousness was noticeable in his gestures. "Uncle, I need to talk to you about something. My things are disappearing, like my watch, my headphones, even that pen you gave me last year. All of it appeared in John's room, under his bed." Gerald didn't answer immediately. He looked at him for long seconds. His eyes, now alert, didn't blink. "Are you telling me he's stealing from us?" Hector maintained his speech with firmness. "I didn't want to accuse anyone, but I'm not the one who puts those things there." Gerald took a deep breath, crossed his arms, And how do you know exactly what's inside his room? Hector froze for an instant, then quickly covered it up. I heard the maid talking. She said she found the things while she was cleaning. But Gerald didn't respond. He just watched him. He had already heard enough. He knew that Hector was trying to frame John to throw them off. From then on, the invisible war inside the mansion intensified. Hector walked through the house like he was stepping on a minefield. John felt his eyes on his back and sometimes woke up to whispers coming from the hallway. Gerald, although quiet, observed everything. His suspicions were no longer in the realm of doubt, and something inside him was starting to hurt again. But this time, it wasn't grief. It was rage. That morning, Gerald couldn't sleep. Sitting in the armchair in his office, he kept his eyes fixed on the cold fireplace, his fingers intertwined over his mouth and Alice's necklace clutched in his hand. He felt surrounded by an invisible weight. It wasn't just his daughter's absence. It was the feeling of having failed her, of having ignored signs that were there all along. John's words, Hector's gestures, the objects that reappeared, everything was spinning in his mind like a macabre puzzle whose pieces were starting to fit together too late. He stood up in silence, as if the mansion were alive and shouldn't be woken up. He went up the stairs slowly, each step creaking as if to denounce his guilt. He stopped in front of Alice's room. The door had remained closed since the day of the wake. No one dared to enter. But now there was something that pushed him. A silent urgency, a need to face the pain head-on. He turned the doorknob. The sweet scent that still floated in the air almost knocked him over. It was as if Alice were still there, dancing with her stuffed animals, inventing stories aloud, asking for just 5 more minutes before bed. The room was exactly as she had left it. The pink quilt with floral embroidery, the desk full of colored pencils, the unicorn piggy bank on the shelf. Gerald walked to the bed, sat down carefully, and placed the necklace on the pillow, as if returning something that should never have been taken. He scanned the room attentively. It was then that he noticed a blue-painted wooden box tucked away on the bottom shelf. Inside, folded drawings, little notes, magazine clippings, and a lilac-colored hardback notebook with stickers on the cover. Alice's diary. Gerald hesitated, touching the cover with reverence. He was afraid of what he would find there, but fear no longer protected him from anything. He took a deep breath and opened the first page. His daughter's childish, rounded handwriting seemed to scream from the lines. Today I played with John again, but I still have to hide it. Daddy can't know. His eyes filled with tears. He continued reading. Each phrase was a stab. Hector came into my room again. He said not to say anything, that it was a secret, but I don't like it. Gerald's hands began to tremble. As he turned more pages, he found phrases scribbled in nervous letters, as if written in a hurry. I'm afraid of Hector. And right below, if something happens. It was him. Gerald pressed the diary against his chest, as if trying to absorb it all with his body. His head was spinning. How did he not notice? How many times did Alice try to tell him something, and he didn't listen? He remembered a night, weeks before the disappearance, when she knocked on his door, saying she needed to talk. He was tired, stressed with work. It can be tomorrow, my love, he said, without even opening the door. It was the last time she tried. Forgive me, my daughter, he whispered, kneeling on the rug, his face buried in his hands. The diary now open before him, with the pages fluttering in the breeze from the half-open window. Everything made sense. Everything John had told him. Everything he himself was beginning to see in Hector's eyes. The pieces were fitting together. But the feeling that dominated Gerald at that moment was not just indignation. It was guilt. A sharp guilt that was tearing him apart in silence. Because a father should protect. A father should know. He stayed there for hours, reading every line, every drawing made with a colored pen, every little bit of his daughter's mind left on paper. It was like listening to Alice for the last time. And she was asking for help. Even after everything, she was still asking. Gerald got up with difficulty, his face wet with tears, his eyes lit by something new. He left the room and went down the stairs with determined steps. Now he was no longer just Alice's father. He was the man she had chosen to listen to her, even if it was too late. And there was someone who had to answer for all of this. The sun had not yet risen when Gerald took his car keys, walked through the kitchen without making a sound, grabbed a coat that was hanging on the back of a chair, and left in silence. Alice's diary was in his bag, along with the necklace and the red bead bracelet she had made herself with plastic beads. He drove toward the state prison, his hands firm on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road, as if each mile covered was a preparation for what was to come. His mind, however, was on fire. What he had read in those pages had changed everything. And now there was a question he could no longer silence. Michael knew. Upon arriving, he handed over his documents, was searched, and led to the visitation room. The environment was cold and gray. A single lamp hanging from the ceiling flickered over the metal table. Gerald sat down, his hands clasped, his nails digging into his palms. The sound of the metal doors opening echoed through the room. When Michael entered, they looked at each other for long seconds. No words, just two brothers, devastated and separated by a tragedy that was irreversible. Michael was downcast, with messy hair and a growing beard. His eyes, however, still seemed to seek a little dignity. "Why did you do it, Michael?" Gerald asked in a firm but broken voice. His brother sat down slowly, avoiding his gaze. "I read the diary. She tried to warn me, and I didn't listen." Michael was quiet for a moment, his eyes downcast. "Are you listening to me?" She wrote it in black and white. She was afraid of Hector. Gerald took the notebook out of his bag and placed it on the table. "She trusted me, and I said it could be tomorrow. Tomorrow." His voice cracked. Anger, pain, and remorse mixed in his chest. Michael ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and then looked at his brother with eyes full of tears. "I knew," he said in a whisper. "Not everything, but I knew." Gerald froze. "That night, I came home early. I saw Alice coming out of Hector's room, crying. I asked what had happened. He said it was a silly fight, that she was just nervous. But she seemed scared." He paused for a long time. "When they said they had found the body, I knew. Even before the police arrived, I already knew. And then, when that boy appeared at the wake, saying he saw her get into a black car, and that it was my car, everything clicked. That day, Hector had secretly taken the car. He kidnapped Alice, he poisoned her, and left her body at your house. Why didn't you tell the truth?" Gerald squeezed the edge of the table tightly, the veins in his neck bulging. Michael lowered his head in shame. "Because I was weak, and because he's my son." The words weighed a ton. "Would you have done anything differently?" The question came out between his teeth, full of pain. Gerald hesitated, his heart on fire. "Yes, I would have protected my daughter." Michael swallowed slowly, still crying. "Well, I protected my son, and I lost both of them." Michael then began to cry. It was not a contained or silent cry. It was a broken, almost childlike cry from someone who no longer knows how to carry what he feels. "I thought I could fix it, that he just needed help, that it was an impulse, a mistake. I didn't want to believe what I saw in his eyes." Gerald watched him, paralyzed. For the first time, he didn't see his brother, but a destroyed father, a man who, out of blind love, chose to give himself up in his son's place. But by doing so, he also destroyed the only possibility of justice for Alice. "You lied to me. You let me bury her believing it had been a stranger. You let me cry on your shoulder," Gerald said, his voice broken but firm. Michael sobbed, still crying. "Because if I told you the truth, you would never look at me again. And now maybe you won't anyway." The silence between them was almost physical. Then Gerald stood up, took his daughter's diary, and put it back in his bag. "Now I look, yes, but not at you. I look at the pain we caused and the truth Alice tried to tell me." As Gerald turned to leave, Michael said in a choked voice, "She didn't deserve it. No child deserves it." Gerald stopped for an instant but did not look back. "It's true, but she spent her whole life trying to talk to me, and I only listened when it was too late." And he left the room. As he passed through the last iron door, he held the diary tightly against his chest, like someone holding a request for forgiveness that would never be answered. But now he knew exactly what he had to do, and it was no longer out of anger or guilt. It was for justice. The sound of the prison door closing behind him still echoed in Gerald's ears when he arrived at the mansion. His body was tired, but his gaze was sharp. There was no longer any doubt or fear. There was a purpose. He went straight up the stairs to Alice's room, took the bag off his back, and carefully placed Alice's diary on his daughter's desk. He opened it again and ran his fingers over a phrase scribbled in the corner of the page. He said it was just a game, but it scared me. Gerald's fist clenched on its own. With every page he read, he felt less like a grieving father and more like a man on the verge of an inevitable confrontation. He didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and called Inspector Anderson, who had accompanied Michael's arrest. "I need you to listen to me, and I need you to listen until the end," he said in a firm voice. He reported everything: the notes in the diary, Hector's strange behavior, the necklace found in his room, the attempts to frame John, and finally, Michael's confession. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Are you sure of what you're saying, Mr. Guzman?" "I am, but more than that, I need you to see it with your own eyes. The mask is going to fall. I just need you to be here when it happens." That afternoon, the mansion seemed like a stage set for the finale of a tragedy. 2 investigators were discreetly positioned in the hallway. The maid was instructed to maintain her routine. John stayed in his room, nervous. Gerald, in turn, sat in the main living room with the diary in his hands, his face outwardly calm, but his muscles tense like strings about to snap. When Hector came down for dinner, with the same arrogant posture as always, Gerald stood up and looked directly at him. "We need to talk." Hector rolled his eyes. "This again?" "No, it's not the same. It's the truth," Gerald replied, pointing to the table. "Sit down." Hector hesitated for a second, then sat down, crossing his arms. Gerald then took a photo of Alice smiling with the butterfly necklace around her neck from the diary. He placed it on the table. "She trusted you. She called you her brother. Do you know what she wrote about you, Hector?" The boy kept his gaze fixed on the wall. "I have no idea." Gerald opened a page and read aloud. "If something happens, it was him." At that moment, the air changed. Hector blinked slowly, then smiled. A short, crooked, almost mocking smile. "And you think a kid's scribble is going to prove anything?" The 2 investigators entered the room in silence, but he wasn't intimidated. "You called the police for this? Because a bratty little girl wrote a name in a notebook?" Gerald approached. His eyes burned. "She wasn't bratty. She was my daughter, and you killed her." The phrase fell like a sentence. Then Hector jumped up, knocking over the chair, and his facade of control shattered completely. "She deserved it," he screamed with bulging eyes. "She was a snitch. She said she was going to tell you. I just wanted her to shut up." The screams echoed throughout the mansion. The investigators looked at each other and advanced quickly. "Don't touch me. You're all hypocrites," he continued to scream as he was immobilized. Gerald remained still, as if time had frozen around him. The scene was devastating. Hector, who had always seemed controlled, was now completely out of control. His hands trembled. His face was red. Saliva was running from the corner of his mouth as he yelled meaningless insults. "You were never a real uncle. Alice was a pest, a snitch. I was just teaching her a lesson." The screams faded as they led him down the hallway, but the damage was already done. The truth had finally been revealed, naked, cruel, and more devastating than anyone there was prepared to face. John, who had discreetly come down the stairs, saw everything from afar. His wide eyes didn't blink, but no tears fell. He just watched. Gerald then turned to him. There were no words between the 2 of them, but there was something in Gerald's gaze that was now complete, a mixture of pain and relief, of guilt and justice. He approached, knelt before the boy, and said in a low voice, "She trusted you, and I do too." John nodded, still in silence. For the first time, he wasn't just the boy who had appeared at the wake. He was the one who prevented the silence from continuing. The news arrived early the next morning. Gerald was in the backyard, sitting near Alice's swing with John at his side, when the phone rang. Inspector Anderson on the other end of the line went straight to the point. Based on the confession, the evidence, and his daughter's diary, Michael would be released today. There was a silence. Gerald looked at the ground, his eyes empty, as if he was still trying to understand what this meant. "He'll need someone to pick him up," the inspector concluded. Gerald responded only with a contained sigh and a simple, "I'll go." The drive to the prison seemed shorter than before, but infinitely heavier. Gerald drove with the windows open, as if the wind could relieve the knot in his throat. He remembered their last conversation, the tears, the harsh words, and everything that, no matter how much it hurt, needed to have been said. Upon arriving, he didn't go in like he had the last time. This time he stayed outside, leaning against the car, with his arms crossed. The iron gate opened slowly, and in the pale morning sun, Michael appeared, thin, more aged than before, with wrinkled clothes and a look that mixed shame and relief. Neither of them moved for an instant. They just looked at each other. There were no more masks, no more defenses, just two brothers before the ruins that surrounded them. Gerald took a small step forward. Michael let out the air he had been holding in his chest. "I thought you weren't coming," he said in a low, almost hoarse voice. Gerald looked at him with teary eyes and a tired face. "I almost didn't." Michael nodded, like someone who understands and accepts. The silence between them was so thick that any word would have seemed like a scream. "I don't know what to say," Michael tried, his shoulders slumped. The guilt was still evident in every gesture. "I asked for her forgiveness every day in there, but I know it's no use." His eyes filled with tears. "Maybe I don't deserve that forgiveness. Not yours, not hers." Gerald looked away for a second, then looked back at him. "You've already lost too much, and so have I." His voice was choked, firm and fragile at the same time. "Now, all we have left is to move forward." Michael tried to hide his crying but couldn't. He covered his face with his hand like a child ashamed of the pain he was carrying inside. Gerald approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. There was no hug yet. No, but there was a gesture, a touch that, coming from him, was a miracle. Michael looked up, surprised. "Do you really forgive me?" Gerald didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath and said, "It's not about forgiveness. It's about not letting the pain swallow what's left." And at that moment, they both knew. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing would be, but it wouldn't be impossible either. The drive back was silent. Michael looked out the window like someone observing a world he no longer recognized. The streets, the trees, the cars, everything seemed new, but stained by memories. When they arrived at the mansion, Michael hesitated before getting out. Gerald noticed. "Did you know she mentioned you in her diary?" he said, looking at the steering wheel. Michael's eyes widened, not understanding. "She said you were funny, that you told her silly stories to help her fall asleep when I was traveling. She said she wished I was more like you." That broke something inside him. Michael cried in silence. He got out of the car without saying anything. Gerald accompanied him to the gate. There, John was waiting for them, leaning against the wall, hugging a teddy bear that belonged to Alice. The boy's eyes met Michael's, and they looked at each other for long seconds. John didn't smile. He didn't move, but he also didn't back away. It was a beginning, a recognition, an attempt, however timid, to rebuild trust, not with words, but with presence. Time passed gently. The mansion, once plunged into grief and silence, began to breathe differently. The flowers in the garden bloomed again, and the hallways of the house no longer seemed so empty. Little by little, life resumed its course, not as it was before, but as it could be after everything. John now had a room all to himself, with new books, simple toys, and a photo of Alice smiling on the headboard. He was no longer a visitor or a temporary guest. He was part of that house. He was part of the family. One clear morning, Gerald called John to the backyard. The two walked side by side to the old wooden swing, where Alice used to spend her afternoons inventing stories. They stood in silence for a few moments, listening to the sound of the wind moving the rope. Gerald, with tears in his eyes, knelt before the boy and held his small hands in his. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you did, John. If you hadn't shown up that day, I might still be in the dark, lost, trapped in a lie." John looked down, emotional. Gerald continued in a firm but broken voice. "You were the courage I didn't have. You were my daughter's voice when no one else was listening. And for that, this house is also yours now. Not out of pity or debt, but because you deserve to be here." John swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" he murmured. Gerald smiled and nodded. "Absolutely sure. Alice would have wanted it this way." It was at that moment that the boy threw himself into his arms in a tight hug, full of everything that words couldn't say. On the other side of the backyard, Michael watched the scene in silence with moist eyes and a heavy heart. He knew he could never erase his mistakes, but maybe he could build something new from here. And in that instant, as he watched John smiling, Michael felt that, even among the ashes, life was trying to blossom again. Slowly he approached and sat down next to them without saying anything. He just was there, present, trying to start over. The swing creaked gently in the breeze. John looked up at the sky, and then at Alice's old diary, now resting in his lap. He ran his fingers over the cover, like someone talking to a person who still lives somewhere else. Gerald watched him with tenderness and said, "She's proud of you." The boy smiled without responding, and in that gentle, meaningful silence, it was clear. Alice lived on in the gestures, in the truth that was revealed, and in the home that was now finally John's as well. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Give it a like to support us, and turn on the notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us keep creating the very best for you. See you next time.